You're having the same argument for the 10th, 20th, 50th, or 100th time, or for the second, third, or 10th year of your relationship, and now you've recognized you have that same pattern, that same cycle, maybe a different day, maybe a different subject, and yet the pattern stays the same. Or maybe you have the exact same issue and you keep having it on repeat, and now your brain knows how this will end. Every single time we have this conversation, every time we have this problem, you know how it's going to go, and it has you thinking, why do we keep doing this? Is this our relationship now? Are we maybe just incompatible? Or even worse, it has you doubting or wondering if you even chose the right partner, and maybe it has you thinking that there is no hope for your relationship. If you've been having these thoughts, I want you to slow down for a moment and share with you. There is research that tells us this is a normal pattern for couples, whether they have it in their first year of their relationship, 5th or 10th or 20th year of their partnership. It's something that you're going to have happen in your relationship. And you are not stuck in a communication issue. You're stuck in a particular pattern that we know very well from research, and something that, as a researcher myself who's worked in a large longitudinal study that ran across the United States, and I've worked with thousands of couples now, something that I've seen repeatedly is that couples get stuck in a repetitive pattern, whether it's a pattern or a particular issue that they find themselves repeating on loops, and quite often it makes them feel hopeless, frustrated, or feeling like maybe their relationship isn't going to work out. But here's the thing. Inside of these patterns or these conversations, there's actually a hidden conversation, and once you unlock what's really happening, then you can start to see why these repetitive fights and arguments happen. And when you see the 5 reasons that I lay out for you today, you'll start to have more insight as to why this occurs, but even more importantly, what you can do. I know that right now you likely feel that you can have that same conversation over and over again, and it's now feeling pretty hopeless. You can repeat yourself, or you can try saying it in a different way, and you've likely already tried that with different words, same outcome. Different angle, same problem. Different approach, yet the same outcome. So no matter how much you talk about it, it feels like nothing really changes. And there's a name for this particular dynamic. In the Gottman work, it's called perpetual problems. It's called unsolvable problems, but don't get stuck on the word so much yet, because it does not mean that you can't solve these issues. It just means we want a different approach. And the first starting point to help you approach these issues differently is to see that underneath these conversations, underneath these particular patterns that are so repetitive in nature, there is something happening underneath, and that is driving most of the issue. So while you're stuck in the same loop, talking about who did what, who's right, who's wrong, arguing facts, you're approaching this problem in a completely backwards kind of way. And once you see that, you can start to interrupt the pattern. You and your partner can shift how you approach this issue. You can give it a name, which the name is perpetual problems, issues that are repetitive in nature, problems or cycles that you find yourselves coming back to again and again. The name for that is perpetual problems. But what we want is not just a name. We want an approach or an understanding that helps us. And later in the video, I'm going to be answering this question for you as well. When you have these repetitive problems, why is it that your brain now starts going to the worst possible outcomes? Why is it that your brain interprets the worst possible meaning? And now, even despite having a great relationship at one point or even now, why does your brain rewrite your partnership or make you feel so stuck or so frustrated like there's no more hope? On point number 4, I'll get into that, but right now, let's jump into the first layer of what's happening when couples are stuck in a repetitive fight or particular cycle. Reason number 1, the hidden conversation. Here's what most couples miss. You're not fighting about the facts of the conversation. You're not fighting about what you think you're fighting about. Underneath every repeated argument or every repeated cyclical issue that you two keep having, there's another discussion happening underneath that one. And that conversation, for most couples, is invisible. And as long as they keep missing that one, they'll keep repeating the same cycle. So you can see this if you talk for hours and you never resolve anything, that should be a signal to you. We're not having the right conversation. We're focusing on communication. We're arguing with words, but our nervous system is having a different dialogue. And that conversation is about what you register underneath the words. In neuroscience, we call this neuroception. And this is what your brain picks up from what is being said. And you do that not through the words, but through the tone, the facial expressions, the body language, the breath. It is by tuning into the unsaid stuff that your body or your brain is interpreting what something means to you or how you should feel about it. So you're not just reacting to what your partner says, but how they say it. And what you're mostly listening to as you're having this conversation, especially as it pertains to repetitive issues or patterns that you and your partner are having, what your body or your brain is scanning for is, do I need to defend or am I safe here? Am I being understood? Or do I need to explain myself and argue more? And once this particular switch flips off in your brain, you're no longer having a conversation. Once that switch goes off in your partner, they're no longer having a discussion with you, but instead, you two are having a physiological reaction to each other. So most of what we experience in a conversation isn't coming from the words. It's coming from tone, facial expression, body language, the breath, micro movements of the face, or in other words, the energy of the conversation. Research even suggests that only 7% of communication is the actual words, and 93% or so of a dialogue or of communication, nearly 100%, 93% of communication is mostly driven by something other than the words. In linguistics, the word for this is prosody, which is all about the rhythm, the tone, and the emotional signal conveyed through what is being said. So I can say the exact same thing to you, and I can say it with a smile, or I can say it with a frown. I can say it forcefully, or I can say it with a whisper. And all of that changes the meaning, doesn't it? So if the message of your words feel off, your partner will pick up on that. If the message feels off, or the vibe is off, or there's a disconnect, then when that happens, you and your partner are no longer discussing the words or the facts. You're now having a discussion more about feeling or the vibe about your conversation. So this now turns into an autonomic loop where your nervous systems are not really listening to the words or to the facts. You are now reacting to a system of the conversation. And this loop, it happens inside your nerves as you talk to each other. This is why when you talk to some people, you feel tense. Some people make you feel relaxed. Some people make you feel at ease. So while you and your partner are talking, both of you are likely thinking, if I just explain it better, they'll understand. If I just say it in a different way, they'll finally get it. And then both of you try different words. Try more clarity, more logic, try more proof. And then it kind of makes both of you feel like you're lawyers arguing in a courtroom, or that you two are inside of a debate, not inside of a conversation or a dialogue. And here's the thing. You're trying to solve a biological reaction with better language. And communication is primarily outside of the words that you're speaking. So the first hidden conversation has a lot to do with the prosody, or the tone, the facial expression, and how something lands. And this is why two people who love each other, they can feel like opponents when they're talking to one another, because they're not very perceptive of how they're coming across to one another. They're interpreting each other constantly, and yet they're unaware of how my words or how my message is being perceived or picked up by the other person. If you're having a conversation and your physiologies signal or feel some sense of threat or disconnect, you stop being in a discussion, and now you're inside of a biological loop where your bodies are responding. And this is the first hidden conversation that keeps repetitive fights feeling unsolvable or hopeless. Once you see that your words only make up, at best, 7% of the conversation, then you'll start to realize or see that it's not about getting the right words, it's about seeing how my words are connecting with my partner and how the feeling of the conversation is going, because you can't solve repetitive issues with better explanations or more logic. But that's just the first layer, because underneath this, there's a second conversation that's occurring and happening as well. So let's dive into the second layer to help us see how repetitive fights stay alive. Underneath all of this, there's a second conversation happening below the first one, or you could say below the conversation that you guys think you're having, there's a first layer and there's a second layer. And the second layer all comes down to one question. What does this actually mean? Most couples think they're fighting up here in the words, the tone, and what was said, or the logical part of the dialogue, but that only makes up one layer, and that's all logic, that's all up here. But the real fight is happening below your head. The second part of the conversation is happening down here in our guts, in our hearts, in the sensations of the conversation. And the second layer goes into the meaning that each of us makes from our conversation, or the meaning that each of us makes from what happened and what is currently going on. So let's jump into reason number 2. Reason 2, you're arguing about the event, but you're living inside of meaning. And now that you understand this first layer, we have to look at what's actually driving the fight. What's driving the second layer now? Not just the small stuff, but the bigger stuff. The stuff that moves us into reactions and moves our bodies or our words in a way that sometimes we kind of go, why did I even say that? Or what was going on with you? Or what was going on with me? How did we lose the conversation? And here's the thing, most couples never make this shift. They think they're arguing about what happened. They think they're arguing about facts. But both of you are actually reacting to what all of this means for you. And every single experience can have many different meanings. So while the facts might be the same, the perspective, the meanings, and the feelings about that experience can be quite different. And you know what? Meaning and facts, they're not the same. So it'll help if we can separate the two. While you two think you're debating facts, like who said what, who did what, who's right, who's wrong, there's another conversation that you two aren't paying attention to. Underneath these repetitive conversations, your brain is asking a completely different question. And that question always boils down to, am I being understood? Does my partner care enough to slow down and listen to me? Can my partner see my side of things? Can they share my experience somehow? And I promise you this, if you're repeating that same conversation or pattern or argument, then the issue isn't about you saying better words or improving your logic. There's actually a mismatch between the words and the understanding and the meaning that drives the majority of your fights. In my work with couples, this is what I call the translation gap. So it doesn't matter how long you've known your partner. You two are very different people. It doesn't matter if you're of the same gender or same ethnicity or grew up in the same country or grew up a block away from each other. You're two different people that are constantly getting different meanings from the same experiences. So even if you've known each other for 5 or 10 years, I promise you this, if you keep having a repetitive argument or a certain cycle that shows up across the board, like finances, children, and other subjects, or just shows up in one area of your relationship, then there's this communication gap. And that gap, it happens all the time. And of course it would. You're different people. While you and your partner have been responding to the content, you have both been reacting to a very different meaning, and you've been missing the translation gap. And here's the thing, even if you think you're translating properly or you think you understand each other really well, when you find these patterns, these are the gaps where you're not doing that so well because you're having that issue over and over again, and the translation gap makes a majority of what keeps this cyclical pattern or particular repetitive issue alive. So one example I see a lot in my work with couples is somebody will say something like, "You never listen to me." And yes, on the surface, that sounds like a complaint or an attack. So logically, the other person will say, that's not true, and they'll defend themselves or they'll attack back. Then, of course, the couple's now in an argument about who's right, who's wrong, or somebody's telling someone, that's not true, that's not really how I feel, that's not true, that's not how you feel. And so now they're arguing and missing layer two, which is the meaning. Yes, words like you never listen to me come off harsh. And of course, a statement like that can be that. But inside those words, there's a meaning, there's a translation that if it's not extracted and not felt and not gotten inside that conversation or properly translated, then you both stay stuck in that same argument and you stay stuck in the content of the words and not the meaning. Quite often when I see couples inside of a repetitive issue or a pattern that they have that keeps repeating and is quite cyclical, I can tell them right off the bat, you're not arguing because you're missing a great explanation or you're not sharing your perspective well enough. What you two are doing is you're missing the meaning, and you two don't need better communication right now. You actually need better translation. In other words, good communication is good translation. It's not about you and your partner explaining yourselves more clearly or better. It's about both of you getting better at translating the meaning behind the words that your partner is sharing. So if your partner says, you never listen to me, we might extract the meaning and say, so you don't feel heard, or you don't feel like I'm taking the time to ask you enough questions about what's going on or what's true for you. In cognitive psychology, we know something really well, and that is that humans do not react to events, they react to the meaning that they assign to the event. The same sentence or the same experience can land in two very different places depending on the story that your mind and your nervous system has attached to that thing or to that experience. Let me give you a very simple example that I see in my office all the time with couples. Having worked with couples that are very poor, at or below the poverty line, and couples on the other extreme that are very wealthy, earning millions and millions of dollars every year, something that I've seen that both these couples, although economically they're very different, they're experiencing the exact same way, and that is fights around money. Fights around money make a big part of the cyclical patterns or fights that I see couples having inside my office or read about, or when I talk to lawyers, some of them have even shared that much of their work that they're doing in divorce work is about two people unable to reconcile views around finances and ultimately using that as the reason for their divorce. Listening to these couples talk about their financial differences or watching the tension that they have when it comes to money or the reactions that they have, they actually look exactly the same. And funny enough, whether poor or rich, the solution for both couples is actually the same, because couples, when they fight about money, they're actually not fighting about money. They're fighting about what money means to them. They're fighting about the meaning that they've attached to finances, such as money might mean security, control, freedom, being valued, being safe. And then what we do with that money gives us that meaning or that sensation in our life. So interestingly enough, poor or rich, different circumstances, same meaning, same fight, same outcome. And the solution to these fights, these repetitive issues that poor or rich couples can have, I have found has always been the same. And it's inside these layers, not the content, not the subject, but the layers. This is why couples, whether rich or poor, can have the same argument over and over again with better words and worse outcomes. Because if you're just focused on the words or the content, you're solving for accuracy when the relationship is asking for connection and safety. And if that connection feels off, your brain takes over. And once that happens, your good intentions stop mattering. Which brings us to reason 3. You're locked in the autopilot pattern. Now, remember the question, why does your brain go to the worst possible meaning when you're locked inside of these repetitive or cyclical arguments? Because over time, your relationship develops a particular pattern. And once that pattern starts, your brain takes over, your nervous system takes over, and then you're no longer responding to your partner, you're reacting to a pattern. Once you know a pattern and you can predict it, your brain and your body go on autopilot. They do what they need to do. And so it's like you've got this groove or this highway, and once you see that pattern coming or you're inside that groove, your brain and your body take over, and now it's like you don't have any control and neither does your partner. For most couples, this pattern plays out in what we call the pursue-withdraw cycle. You've felt this pattern in your relationship before. One of you wants to talk and the other one feels overwhelmed by those conversations or wants distance sooner than the other partner who wants to talk. One of you pushes for the conversation, pushes for resolution, and the other one pushes hard or tries to meet that request but finds himself feeling overwhelmed or shut down, and then the other partner feels like they're being rejected or shut out, and then they heat up and get more anxious and start talking more, get more frustrated, and then both of you get shut down, flooded, frustrated, angry, and the talk somehow just ends abruptly. And though it might not feel this way, this isn't happening because neither of you cares. It happens because both of you regulate in different ways. One partner regulates by leaning in and trying to have the conversation, and the other partner tends to regulate more by taking some time away or space to think and gather their thoughts. One person regulates by talking and trying to solve the issue all at once, and the other person does better taking it in batches or easily feels overwhelmed by the intensity of the conversation, and then both of you tend to escalate because what you need and what your partner needs are quite different, and now you're inside of a loop. And that loop is one person's pushing and the other person's running or shutting down. But here's the thing, we can change this pattern when we recognize this. One person's self-protection is the dismantling or frustration for the other partner. So the move that helps one person feel safe is the exact move that makes the other partner feel unsafe. Neither of you is wrong, and neither one of you are the problem. The pattern is the problem. One of you is fighting for connection, the other one of you is fighting for peace. But to the both of you, this feels like escalation, pressure, or rejection. And once you enter this type of dialogue, you enter what I call the autopilot pattern, because once it starts, it runs on its own. One of you pushes, the other one shuts down, and it feels like neither one of you has control. Even when you see it happening, you can see it happening and not stop it. This is where most couples get stuck, because insight isn't enough. Even if you know this pattern, even if you understand it perfectly, you can still find yourself repeating it multiple times a day or within a few minutes after watching this video, because insight is top down. Insight happens up here. It lives in our thoughts. It lives in our logic. But this particular pattern is bottom up. It starts inside the body. It starts in the nervous system. It's not purely logical because most communication isn't logical. And in the heat of the moment, in the heat of these repetitive cycles, our bodies will always move faster than logic. There's a point in every single conflict. It's what I call the biological point of no return. This is the space where your system is too activated or too frustrated or too overwhelmed to really have a productive conversation. And once you cross that point, no amount of good communication is going to save that moment. That's why so many couples can say, I knew what was happening and I still couldn't stop it. I've seen us do this so many times and yet we keep doing it. Because inside of these repetitive cycles or arguments that you're having, you're not just having a conversation, you're stuck or having a biological experience, and you're having a biological loop, and this biological dance is quite complicated. If you want a deeper breakdown on how to actually interrupt this pattern in real time, I've linked a full walkthrough for you right here and in the description down below. But for right now, understand this. Until you learn how to work with this pattern, you will keep getting pulled back into it consciously or unconsciously because logic and nervous system do not always match, and emotions will always work faster than logic. Now, this brings us to reason number 4 for why couples get stuck in these repetitive patterns. You're missing the repair threshold. Here's one of the most hopeful findings in relationship research, and it's this: couples who last the longest or are the happiest are not certainly the ones who avoid conflict, they're actually the couples who know how to come back and repair after conflict occurs. So if there's one known truth inside of every single relationship is conflict will occur, ruptures will happen, but couples who are thriving and doing well come back after conflict. Not every single time, not perfectly, but statistically, they do it often and they do it frequently. And before we go any further, let me clarify. Relationship success is not just the time that we have together, but how happy we are inside that time, or how much we can reduce conflict escalating. So let's lay the groundwork for what repair means, because most couples, when they hear the word repair, they think it means apologizing, fixing, and promising to never do that thing again. But that's not what actually is repair. That's not what repair actually is. Repair is not about solving the problem. Repair is about restoring the connection, because in one of our earlier points we talked about this. The goal is not to avoid conflict, it's to stay in connection, or rather to have a biological reset so that we can tell each other's nervous system in these different layers of communication. We can communicate to each other, we're okay, I'm here for you, we are together, and we will work on this together. So repair, honestly, is a lot easier than people think it is. See, instead of apologizing or promising that you won't do something again, what you can do when you come back for repair is try to make up with your partner. You can use a softer tone, a small touch, a little humor, but most importantly, you can tell your partner, I want to understand you, I want us to stay together, I want to work on things with you. Can I try to understand how you saw things, and would you be willing to do the same thing for me? Now, if that happens, you are doing 95% of repair, and you can stop apologizing or feeling guilty, and you can go into understanding. So, what do we need to then not cross over that repair threshold? Couples get stuck in two places, two critical spots when it comes to repair. The first one is they go over that threshold, right? They don't do a very good job of recognizing what are the signs that I'm going to go over that threshold where repair feels nearly impossible. So here's the spot where most couples get stuck, and there's two critical areas when it comes to repair that most couples aren't aware of and frankly find themselves getting stuck in a lot. Point number 1 is they don't know how to pause conversations before they go over that repair threshold. You know those moments where you get so worked up or so mad or so shut down that you say things that you didn't really mean, or you say things that come out harsher than you really wanted them to. They might have been reasonable or healthy things to say, but you said it with such anger, such spite, or you said something with so much anger that it wasn't really what you wanted to say. Either way, the point is there's this threshold inside of our nervous systems that once our blood, so to speak, or our heart rate and our body gets so tense that we go over that threshold and we go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And once we go into one of these sympathetic states, once we go into one of these hijack states, we cross over. And we are no longer the loving partner that you know. We're no longer the safe, connected, attached, bonded partner, but instead, we're more like an animal in survival. When you're that animal in survival, you will fight, you will punch, you will scream, you will yell, or you will run, or you will shut down in a way that is the antithesis of connection or bonding. And this isn't completely your fault, because One of the things that's happening inside these repetitive issues is you go over that threshold, your body and your nervous system goes into fight, flight, freeze, and then you go on to autopilot, and there's no exit on that highway. Now your body and your brain are completely shut down and you are in a survival state. So point number one here is we need to pause and learn how to stop conversations before they go over that threshold. Now, in the description, I've left a worksheet for you, as I commonly do in most of my videos, and you and your partner can fill this out so that you two can get to know what is that threshold and how do we protect the relationship and each other from going over that threshold. So inside the description, I have that link for you, but for right now, what I want you to think about is there's this threshold that if your body gets so escalated, so hijacked, so worked up, you're going to go over it. And then true repair won't really occur, which brings us to point number two here. Part number two is we learn how to pause or stop the dialogue before we go over that threshold. We take a break, we calm down, and then part number two here is we do come back and we make a repair attempt. And as I said earlier, a repair attempt is not apologizing, fixing, resolving, but instead it's trying to restore the biological connection that is critical for a healthy relationship. As humans, we bond to each other. As humans, we need to feel safe with one another, and apologizing oftentimes doesn't do the trick. And the reason for that, even though the intention with an apology is there, the reason why apologizing doesn't do the trick is because it's not your apology that we need. It's the sense that you understand that I'm hurting, and we took enough space to calm down, but then we came back and we checked in with each other. Hey, are you okay? I'm sorry things got really hot. I know that I wasn't really understanding you, and I want to understand you, and I hope that you want to do the same thing for me, because these are the sub-conversations happening in every single repetitive fight. Am I safe with you? Will you understand me? Will you take the space to repair with me? Will you remind me that you love me, care for me, and want to be with me? So in repair, we're really speaking to those conversations, and that is 95% of repair. Learning how to spot that threshold, and there's a worksheet for this, and then learning how to come back, which I'll talk in other videos about further as well. How do we do repair? How do we come back? Because if we deplete or go over that threshold, we deplete so much of the goodness in the relationship, and then it's like we're working our way out of debt. And so not only are we gone over that threshold and depleted all the good feelings in the relationship, now it's just so much work and so much labor just to get back to ground zero with your partner, where you can even just relax around each other and feel like it's okay, or you can actually give each other love and affection. Reason number 5, you're living inside of negative sentiment override. This is one of the most invisible and most destructive patterns of all inside of relationships, because if couples go over that repair threshold and they don't come back and do repair, then our brains and our bodies and our hearts, they don't just respond, they change, they react differently, and we start to see our relationship and even our history in a very different kind of way. In clinical research, when couples go into seeing the relationship in a very negative way and having reactions that feel much larger than the situation calls for, we know that what's happening is couples are going into what we call negative sentiment override, or NSO for short. And negative sentiment override, explained very simply, is this concept and this very real thing that happens where things have been so negative inside the relationship that our brains and our processing system, if you will, begins to see things from that elevated place. So now a issue around parenting, or an issue around intimacy, or an issue around a date night, or something even simple as like a dirty dish is seen from a very negative perspective, because there's this context or this Pavlovian type of response where we've been elevated and hijacked enough times that now something small feels quite big, because we get alarmed in a much bigger way. We get more elevated because that thing no longer means some kind of small neutral thing. Now it has all this emotional context to it, doesn't it? And then we start interpreting our partner as maybe being hurtful or intentional, and things don't feel neutral or even good anymore. So now the relationship has this kind of frame or this lens of what we call a negative sentiment override, where we override most things in the relationship or lots of things in the relationship from a negative perspective. So things feel like, a forgotten errand, feels intentional, feels like I was actually forgotten. A delayed response by your partner feels like rejection. And here's the part that most people don't realize. This doesn't just change the present, it changes how we view the past, the present, and the future. Because the emotional context of how we experience something has a big part of how we reconstruct memories. And that's all memory is a reconstruction. And when you're inside of negative sentiment override, your brain starts rewriting history, the present and the future, from that negative lens. And I can watch this with couples in real time. When they're inside of these battles, especially when they happen for a duration of time, they might show up to sessions and say, you know what, our relationship has never really been very good, or, we probably shouldn't even be married, we're horrible together, or, most of what we do is fight. And then couples who have this negative sentiment override, when they start to shift, they might come back in and say things like, I was just really heated in that moment. I don't really think our relationship is so bad. I just think we have some more difficult moments that we need to work through. But here's the thing. When you're inside of negative sentiment override, it layers so much of the relationship like a filter on the camera lens that all of a sudden most things start to look red, even though there might be some yellow and some blues or other colors and hues to the relationship. But negative sentiment override makes it look mostly black or mostly painful. And though you know that your partner loves you and cares about you, you can still feel unsafe with them because you don't understand the world purely through logic. You also understand it through how you feel. And you also understand it through how your nervous system responds in a situation. Now, before we get too caught up in this bad news, let me give you some good news. And that is, this is not a permanent state for couples. It is possible for couples to turn the corner, so to speak, and to shift the relationship. And it's not about changing your good communication or bad communication. It's about shifting the experiences that you two have with each other as a couple. It's about rewiring your nervous systems and creating more moments consistently that feel safe, that feel connective, that feel positive, that feel affirmative. And one of the ways that we can do that is by playing some games with each other or having some simple practices. In the work that I do with couples, one of the things I like to do with them is I have them play the appreciation game. And no, this is not a sales pitch, because you can download this for free or you can make up your own game that is exactly like this. It's very simple. The idea behind the appreciation game is that you think of things that you appreciate about your partner and you lean into making these statements with each other, and you start to build a habit or a practice in your relationship that reinforces one of these sub-communications, which is I appreciate you, I care about you, I value you, I see the goodness in you. And if you start to have more experiences where you and your partner feel this way about each other and show this sentiment with each other, couples can cross over into what we call positive sentiment override. And that is the opposite of negative sentiment override. And we can do this proactively by playing a game like the appreciation game. And it's very, very simple to play a game like this. You just think of statements like, you make me laugh by. You make me laugh by doing what? I love when you wear this outfit. I love when you do this dance. I appreciate that this week you and I did X, Y, and Z. This week you made my life easier by. You can make your own list. You can download the game for free on our website. You can buy the deck of cards if you'd like. The idea is that if you want to go from negative sentiment override, we need to change the sentiment in the relationship. And by acknowledging these 5 different layers of these repetitive issues, you can begin to change the sentiment in your partnership. What changes a relationship is acknowledging that when you're talking about a surface subject, you're also talking about other layers inside that subject, and you can begin to change your relationship. In the next upcoming video, I'll be talking about these layers further so that you can really get to the root of what causes negative sentiment override, repetitive issues, or a collapse in the relationship. But until then, you have enough right now to equip you with some really deep understanding and a way to approach these repetitive cycles or these redundant conversations with your partner in a more empowered and loving way. And until then, I'll see you in the next video.